winter of 1924 in the San Juan Mountains of Colorado was unforgiving. But the silence inside Blackwood Sanatorium was something far worse. For 7 years, the institution had stood as a beacon of hope for those afflicted with tuberculosis, its reputation built on the vision of Dr. Silas Wentworth, a physician who promised what no other could. Not merely treatment, but a true cure. Patients traveled from across the nation to seek his revolutionary methods, their families paying fortunes for a chance at salvation. Until the morning of February 9th, when a supply wagon arrived to find the sanatorium's gates frozen open and every window dark. Inside, the dining hall was set for breakfast. Steam still rose from the porridge, but not a single patient, nurse, or doctor remained. Only one thing was found in every room, every hallway, every corner of that vast stone building: small pools of blood, and beside each one, something that should never have been removed from a living body. The United States Public Health Service sealed the investigation within 48 hours, but the question remained unanswered for decades. What cure could possibly require a patient to surrender their tongue? But before we unseal the archives on this case, leave your comment below. What country and city are you listening from? And what exact time of day or night does the darkness feel thickest where you are? Your answer helps us know just how far these stories are reaching. What you are about to hear comes from Case File 7-342 of the United States Public Health Service, declassified in 1979 under the Freedom of Information Act. Though with 60% of its contents permanently redacted for reasons listed only as ongoing national security concerns, the story begins not in 1924, but 6 years earlier, in the final months of the Great War. Dr. Silas Wentworth was not always a man obsessed with silence. Those who knew him at Johns Hopkins described a brilliant but conventional surgeon, a man whose hands could perform miracles, but whose ambitions extended no further than a respectable practice in Baltimore. The war changed him, as it changed so many. Serving in a field hospital in the Argonne Forest, Wentworth treated soldiers exposed to mustard gas. He watched them drown in their own lungs, their throats closing, their voices reduced to wet gasps. Most died, but some, a very small percentage, survived the initial exposure only to develop something the medical literature had never properly documented. Their lungs would heal, scarred, but functional, but they could not speak. Not because their vocal cords were damaged, but because something in the gas had fundamentally altered the tissue of their throats in ways that seemed to defy every principle of medicine Wentworth understood. He became fascinated by these cases. He began requesting transfers to units where gas exposure was most common. He took samples, wrote detailed notes, conducted examinations that his colleagues found increasingly disturbing in their thoroughness. When the war ended and Wentworth returned to the United States, he did not return to Baltimore. Instead, he traveled to Colorado, to the high-altitude town of Silver Peak, population 312, where he purchased a former silver baron's mansion and converted it into what he called a sanatorium for respiratory diseases. The locals were initially grateful. Tuberculosis was rampant in the mountain communities, and a real doctor with real credentials was a godsend. The first patients who arrived in 1919 were treated with conventional methods: fresh air, nutritious food, bed rest. But by 1920, something had changed in Dr. Wentworth's approach, and the cure rate at Blackwood Sanatorium became, according to his published reports, extraordinary. By 1922, Blackwood Sanatorium had become legendary in medical circles, though not all the attention was admiring. Dr. Wentworth published a paper in the Journal of the American Medical Association claiming a 93% cure rate for advanced tuberculosis. This was impossible. The best facilities in the nation, with unlimited resources, could barely achieve 30%. Most patients with advanced disease simply died. The medical establishment demanded proof. Wentworth invited inspectors. What they found was documented in a report filed by Dr. Harold Yates of the Massachusetts Board of Health. He arrived at Blackwood in August of 1922, prepared to expose a charlatan. Instead, he found patients who had arrived months earlier with lungs full of tubercular lesions, now breathing clearly, their X-rays showing remarkable healing. Dr. Yates examined 12 patients personally. He verified their medical histories. He checked their previous diagnoses against their current conditions. In his report, he wrote, "I cannot explain what I have witnessed. These patients should be dead. Instead, they appear to be recovering in ways that contradict everything I understand about the progression of tuberculosis." But there was something else in Yates's report, a detail he mentioned almost as an afterthought. All of the patients I examined were notably quiet. When I asked questions, they would write their answers on small chalkboards they carried. Dr. Wentworth explained this as a medically prescribed silence, part of the treatment protocol to rest the respiratory system. At the time, this seemed reasonable. The report gave Blackwood Sanatorium legitimacy. Patients began arriving in greater numbers. Wentworth expanded the facility, adding a new wing, hiring more nurses. He became selective, accepting only the most severe cases, those whom other institutions had deemed terminal. The families who sent their loved ones to Blackwood were desperate. They paid astronomical fees. They signed extensive consent forms for experimental treatments. They agreed to limited visitation, as Dr. Wentworth insisted that emotional disturbances could interfere with the cure. And they waited for letters from their family members, letters that came regularly at first, full of hope and descriptions of improvement. But as the months passed, the letters became shorter. The handwriting became shakier, and eventually, for many families, the letters stopped coming altogether. This did not raise immediate alarm. Tuberculosis patients often died suddenly. Wentworth's explanations were medically sound. The bodies were cremated quickly, as was standard practice to prevent contagion. Death certificates were filed promptly. But in January of 1924, something happened that Dr. Wentworth could not explain away. On January 14, 1924, a woman collapsed outside a general store in Durango, Colorado, 80 miles from Blackwood Sanatorium. She was emaciated, frostbitten, wearing only a thin hospital gown under a stolen coat. When the store owner tried to help her, she opened her mouth to speak. There was nothing inside but a healed scar where her tongue should have been. The woman was taken to Mercy Hospital in Durango, where Dr. Elizabeth Marsh examined her. The patient could not speak, could not write coherently due to severe malnutrition and psychological trauma, but she could nod or shake her head to questions. Dr. Marsh's report, preserved in the declassified file, documents the examination. The removal of the tongue was surgical, performed with precision. The wound had healed completely, suggesting the procedure occurred months prior. There were also signs of other surgical interventions. Small incisions along the throat, healed but visible. Scarring inside the nasal passages. And something else, something Dr. Marsh noted with obvious confusion. The patient's lungs were completely clear. No signs of tuberculosis whatsoever. The patient was identified through a locket she wore. Her name was Catherine Pierce, age 28, admitted to Blackwood Sanatorium in June of 1923 with advanced pulmonary tuberculosis. Her family had been told she died in October. They had received her death certificate. They had mourned her. Yet here she was, alive, cured of tuberculosis, but mutilated in ways that had no medical justification. Dr. Marsh immediately contacted the county sheriff. Within hours, a telegram was sent to the United States Public Health Service. An investigation was ordered. Federal agents were dispatched, but Catherine Pierce never testified. 3 days after her arrival at Mercy Hospital, she died. The official cause of death was listed as pneumonia complicated by exposure. But a nurse who was present told a different story to her family, a story that only emerged decades later when her personal diary was donated to a historical society. The nurse wrote, "Catherine became agitated on the third night. She kept pointing at her throat, then at the window. When I came to check on her at dawn, she was dead. Her eyes were open, her hands were clutching her throat, and on the windowsill there was something I cannot explain. A small glass vial, the kind used for medical specimens. Inside was a piece of tissue, preserved in some kind of fluid. I knew what it was. I had been a surgical nurse. It was a human tongue. On February 7, 1924, 2 federal agents arrived at Blackwood Sanatorium unannounced. They were accompanied by the county sheriff and a medical examiner from Denver. Their orders were clear: inspect the facility, interview all patients and staff, and determine whether Dr. Silas Wentworth was conducting unauthorized medical experiments. They were greeted at the gate by Dr. Wentworth himself, who appeared cordial and cooperative. He provided a tour of the facility, showed them patient records, introduced them to his nursing staff. Everything appeared to be in order. The agents requested to interview patients privately. Wentworth agreed without hesitation. He explained that most patients were under strict vocal rest protocols, but could communicate through writing. He provided a list of 42 current residents. The agents began their interviews in the common room. The first patient was a man named Thomas Whitmore, age 53, admitted with tuberculosis 8 months prior. He sat calmly as the agents asked their questions, writing his answers on a small chalkboard in neat, careful script. Agent Morrison, whose report comprises 30 pages of the declassified file, documented the interview. Whitmore confirmed he was being treated for tuberculosis. He stated his condition had improved dramatically. When asked about the treatment protocol, he wrote that it involved a special inhalation therapy, administered twice daily. When asked if he had undergone any surgical procedures, he hesitated before writing only what was medically necessary for the cure. Agent Morrison then asked Whitmore to open his mouth. The report states, subject became visibly distressed. Dr. Wentworth, who had been observing from the doorway, stepped forward and stated that such an examination would require a medical warrant. When I insisted, citing the federal investigation, Wentworth reluctantly agreed. Subject opened his mouth. The tongue was present and appeared normal. I felt foolish. Perhaps the Pierce woman's case was an isolated incident, a botched procedure that Wentworth had tried to cover up. The agents interviewed 6 more patients that afternoon. All had their tongues. All wrote similar answers about remarkable improvement and innovative treatments. By evening, Agent Morrison was beginning to doubt the entire premise of the investigation. Then the supply wagon failed to arrive for dinner, and Dr. Wentworth made an announcement that the evening meal would be delayed. The agents decided to stay overnight to complete their interviews the following morning. They were given rooms in the staff quarters. Agent Morrison reported that he slept poorly, troubled by a sound he could not identify. A wet, rhythmic clicking that seemed to come from the walls themselves. Agent Morrison woke at dawn on February 9th to absolute silence. His report describes the morning with clinical precision, though the typescript shows strike-through marks and rewritten passages, as if he struggled to find words that would be believed. I dressed and left my quarters at approximately 6:30. The hallway was empty. I proceeded to Agent Dalton's room and knocked. No answer. I entered and found the room vacant, the bed neatly made as if never slept in. I went downstairs to the dining hall. The long tables were set for breakfast. Bowls of porridge had been placed at each seat, steam still rising from the surface. Coffee had been poured into cups, but the room was empty. Not a single patient, not a single staff member. Not my fellow agent, not the sheriff, not the medical examiner. I called out. My voice echoed through the building. No response. I began a systematic search. The kitchen was abandoned mid-preparation. A pot of oatmeal still simmered on the stove. Bread sat half-sliced on the cutting board. The nurse's station on the second floor was empty, but patient charts lay open as if someone had been reviewing them moments before. I checked every patient room on the second floor. Every bed was made. Personal belongings remained. Photographs, books, slippers arranged neatly beside each bed. But no people. Then I found the first pool of blood. It was in room 214, beside the bed. Not a large amount, perhaps a few tablespoons. And next to it, resting on the wooden floor, was a human tongue. Fresh, still glistening. Agent Morrison's training as a federal investigator kept him methodical. He did not panic, he did not flee. He continued his search, documenting what he found in each location. Room 215, another pool of blood, another tongue. Room 216, the same. The pattern repeated throughout the second floor, then the third, then the ground floor. In the common room where he had interviewed patients the day before, he found 7 pools of blood arranged in a neat semicircle and 7 tongues. In the medical theater, where surgeries were performed, he found surgical instruments laid out on a tray. They were clean, recently sterilized. But the floor beneath the operating table was dark with blood that had seeped into the cracks between the boards. Agent Morrison finally allowed himself to consider what seemed impossible. Everyone in Blackwood Sanatorium had lost their tongue within the past few hours, and then they had simply walked away. But to where? Agent Morrison found the door to the basement locked. This struck him as significant. Every other door in the sanatorium had been left open, as if whoever departed wanted to ensure nothing remained hidden. He broke the lock with a fire axe from the emergency cabinet. The stairs descended into darkness. Morrison lit a kerosene lamp and made his way down. The basement was vast, extending far beyond the footprint of the building above. The air was cold and carried a chemical smell he recognized from his brief time working in a hospital morgue. Formaldehyde mixed with something else, something organic and wrong. The first room he entered appeared to be a standard storage area. Medical supplies, linens, canned goods. Nothing unusual. But at the back of the room, behind shelves of bandages, he found another door. This one was steel, new, completely out of place in the old mansion's foundation. It was unlocked. Beyond it was a laboratory that belonged in a university research hospital, not a mountain sanatorium. Glass cabinets filled with specimen jars, a dozen microscopes arranged on a long table, centrifuges, incubators, equipment Morrison could not even name. And along one wall, filing cabinets containing hundreds of folders. Morrison opened the nearest cabinet. Inside were patient files, but not the sanitized versions Dr. Wentworth had shown the agents upstairs. These contained surgical notes, detailed procedures, photographs that Morrison's report describes only as documenting progressive stages of the treatment protocol. He found Catherine Pierce's file, admitted June of 1923 with advanced tuberculosis. The first several pages documented conventional treatment, but then, in August, the notes changed. A new entry in Dr. Wentworth's handwriting. Patient has consented to phase 1 of the Wentworth protocol. Initial glossectomy performed. Subject tolerated procedure well. Respiratory observation to follow. Glossectomy. The surgical removal of the tongue. Morrison read further. Phase 2 involved the introduction of what Wentworth called a therapeutic culture directly into the pharyngeal cavity. Phase 3 involved weekly applications of this culture. Phase 4 was listed simply as integration complete. Every patient file followed the same pattern. Conventional treatment, then consent to the experimental protocol, then the removal of the tongue, then the introduction of the mysterious culture. And in every file, without exception, the tuberculosis disappeared within 3 months. But there was something else in these files. Sketches, anatomical drawings that showed the human throat and lungs, but with modifications, structures that should not exist, tissue that appeared to have properties unlike anything in medical literature. And in the margin of one sketch, in Wentworth's precise handwriting, the cure does not eliminate the disease, it replaces the patient. Agent Morrison found Dr. Wentworth's personal journal in a locked drawer of the laboratory desk. What he read there formed the core of the Public Health Service's decision to classify the entire investigation. The journal began in 1918 during Wentworth's service in France. The early entries documented his growing obsession with the soldiers who survived mustard gas exposure but lost their ability to speak. He had collected tissue samples, preserved them, smuggled them back to the United States in violation of military protocol. But the crucial entries came from late 1919 after Wentworth had established Blackwood Sanatorium. He wrote, "I have cultured the organism successfully. It is not a bacterium. It is not a fungus. It exists in a state between life and death, requiring a host, but also transforming the host in ways that suggest intelligence, or at least purposeful adaptation." Wentworth described his discovery in terms that mixed scientific observation with something approaching religious awe. The organism, which he never properly named, had been present in the mustard gas manufacturing facilities in Germany, not as a contaminant, but as something that thrived in the chemical environment. When soldiers were exposed to the gas, a small percentage inhaled not just the poison, but also this organism. It colonized their throats. It consumed damaged tissue and replaced it with something new, something that allowed the host to survive the gas exposure, but at the cost of their voice. The tongue, Wentworth theorized, interfered with the organism's ability to fully integrate. It had to be removed. In tuberculosis patients, the effect was even more dramatic. The organism did not just heal the damaged lung tissue. It replaced it entirely, creating structures that functioned like lungs but were fundamentally different. Better, more efficient. Patients could breathe in thin mountain air at high altitude without difficulty. They needed less oxygen. They could hold their breath for minutes at a time. But there was a cost. The journal entries from 1923 grew increasingly disturbed. Wentworth wrote, "The patients are changing in ways I did not anticipate. They no longer sleep in normal patterns. They gather in the common room at night and sit in complete silence, facing each other in circles. When I observe them, they turn to look at me in perfect unison. Their eyes reflect light like animals." And then, in December of 1923, "They are communicating. I do not know how. They have no tongues, they make no sounds, yet they are sharing information. Yesterday I found them all in the courtyard, standing in formation, perfectly still despite the freezing temperature. They remained there for 6 hours." The last entry in Dr. Wentworth's journal was dated February 8, 1924, one day before Agent Morrison woke to find the sanatorium abandoned. It read, "They have asked me to join them. I do not know how I know this, as they cannot speak and have written nothing. Yet the request is unmistakable. Tonight, they will complete the transition. They have explained that the organism has reached critical mass. 42 hosts, all fully integrated, create a network capable of something beyond individual survival. They will become a collective, a new form of life. They have promised me that the cure will be permanent. That tuberculosis and all respiratory disease will be eliminated from their bodies forever, that they will live for decades, perhaps centuries, in perfect health. But they will no longer be entirely human. They will be something else, something better, they assure me. I have agreed to perform the final procedures. The federal agents suspect nothing. By morning, we will be gone. The organism requires isolation to complete its work. We will travel north, into the deep wilderness, where we can exist without interference. I understand now what I witnessed in France. The soldiers who survived were not lucky. They were chosen. The organism selects for intelligence, for resilience, for hosts worthy of transformation. It has been waiting, dormant in its chemical cradle for thousands of years. The war merely released it, and I have given it exactly what it needed: a sanctuary, willing subjects, and time to grow. Tomorrow I too will surrender my tongue, and I will finally understand what my patients have been trying to tell me. Agent Morrison's report includes a final detail that the Public Health Service redacted from all official accounts, but which appears in the declassified file. I searched the laboratory for samples of this organism Wentworth described. I found nothing. Every specimen jar was empty, recently cleaned. Every culture dish had been sterilized. It was as if they took it with them, every trace of it. Morrison left Blackwood Sanatorium that morning and rode directly to the nearest telegraph office. He sent an urgent message to his superiors in Washington. By that evening, a team of military personnel had secured the facility. By the following week, every document had been removed, every surface had been scrubbed with carbolic acid, and every remaining piece of equipment had been incinerated. The official report stated only, "Investigation inconclusive. Facility deemed unsanitary and ordered permanently closed." The United States Army conducted a search of the San Juan Mountains that lasted 6 weeks. They deployed over 200 soldiers, tracking dogs, and local guides who knew every trail and canyon in the region. They found nothing. No bodies, no camps, no evidence that 42 patients, a full medical staff, and Dr. Silas Wentworth himself had ever walked into that frozen wilderness. The search parties covered over 500 square miles. They investigated abandoned mines, remote cabins, even caves used by indigenous peoples centuries before. One search party reported finding tracks in the snow near the headwaters of the Animas River, 15 miles north of the sanatorium. The tracks appeared human, but the pattern was wrong. The commanding officer's report described them as footprints in single file, perfectly spaced, as if the individuals were walking in lockstep. The tracks led into a narrow canyon and then simply stopped, mid-stride, as if the people making them had vanished into the air itself. Another party found something stranger. In a clearing at nearly 12,000 feet elevation, where the air was too thin for prolonged human activity, they discovered a circle of stones arranged with geometric precision. In the center of the circle, the snow had melted despite the sub-freezing temperature. The ground beneath was black, and nothing grew there. A sample of the soil was taken for analysis. The laboratory report stated, soil contains unknown organic compounds. Extreme toxicity to plant life. Recommend further study. No further study was ever conducted. The sample disappeared from the Army laboratory 3 days after it arrived. The families of the missing patients demanded answers. Several hired private investigators. One family, the Whitmores of Boston, filed a lawsuit against the federal government demanding access to the investigation records. The case was dismissed on grounds of national security. The judge who made the ruling died of a sudden stroke 6 months later. By 1925, the search had been abandoned. Blackwood Sanatorium was demolished. The site was sold to a mining company that never developed it. Over the following decades, the land changed hands 7 times. Each owner reported the same problem. Workers refused to stay on the property after dark. They reported hearing sounds like breathing coming from the ground itself. In 1947, the land was purchased by the United States Forest Service and declared a protected wilderness area. Official reason, preservation of native habitat. The real reason, buried in classified correspondence, ensure no civilian access. The Blackwood case was never solved. Agent Morrison continued working for the Public Health Service until his retirement in 1953, but he never spoke publicly about what he found in that basement laboratory. His grandchildren later reported that in his final years, suffering from dementia, he would sometimes wake in the night and insist that he could hear clicking sounds in the walls. Wet, rhythmic clicking, just like he had heard that last night in the sanatorium. The declassified files released in 1979 created a brief flurry of interest among conspiracy theorists and medical historians. But the redactions were so extensive that no coherent narrative could be constructed. Most researchers concluded it was simply another case of experimental medicine gone wrong, a cautionary tale about the dangers of unregulated treatment. But there are details that suggest the story did not end in February of 1924. In 1968, a group of hikers went missing in the San Juan Mountains, less than 10 miles from the former site of Blackwood Sanatorium. They were experienced mountaineers, well-equipped, following a marked trail. Search parties found their camp intact, their supplies untouched, but the hikers themselves were gone. The only unusual detail, their footprints led away from the camp in single file, perfectly spaced, before vanishing at the edge of a cliff face where no human could have continued. And in 2003, a geology survey team reported an anomaly in the same region. Ground-penetrating radar detected a series of cavities deep beneath the mountains, too regular to be natural formations. The cavities appeared to be connected by tunnels, forming a network that extended for miles. When the team requested permission to conduct a more detailed survey, the request was denied by the Department of the Interior without explanation. The files on Blackwood Sanatorium remain sealed at the National Archives, classified under a restriction that will not expire until 2075, 151 years after the disappearance. That is a very long time to keep a secret, unless the secret is still growing.